From the church office building in Salt Lake City, we now introduce David O. McKay, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Many people today, especially young people, are troubled with the apparent conflict between science and religion. To me, there has been no serious difficulty in reconciling the principles of true religion and true science, for both are concerned with the searching out the eternal truths of the universe. If man knew and understood all truth, he would find that there is no disharmony between the two. In the meantime, we shall continue our search for truth as a wise Father has decreed, to a great extent by faith.
The director of the George C. Marshall Space Flight Center at Huntsville, Alabama, Dr. Wernher von Braun, one of the world's foremost space authorities, expresses himself this way.
Today, more than ever before, our survival, yours and mine and our children's, depends on our adherence to ethical principles. Ethics alone will decide whether atomic energy will be an earthly blessing or the source of mankind's utter destruction. Where does the desire for ethical action come from? What makes us want to be ethical? I believe there are two forces which move us. One is belief in a last judgment, when every one of us has to account for what he did with God's great gift of life on the earth. The other is belief in an immortal soul, a soul which will cherish the award or suffer the penalty decreed in a final judgment. Belief in God and in immortality thus gives us the moral strength and the ethical guidance we need for virtually every action in our daily lives. In our modern world, many people seem to feel that science has somehow made such religious ideas untimely or old-fashioned. But I think science has a real surprise for the skeptics. Science, for instance, tells us that nothing in nature, not even the tiniest particle, can disappear without a trace. Think about that for a moment. Once you do, your thoughts about life will never be the same. Science has found that nothing can disappear without a trace. Nature does not know extinction. All it knows is transformation. Now, if God applies this fundamental principle to the most minute and insignificant parts of his universe, doesn't it make sense to assume that he applies it also to the masterpiece of his creation, the human soul? I think it does. And everything science has taught me and continues to teach me strengthens my belief in the continuity of our spiritual existence after death. Nothing can disappear without a trace.
Another eminent man of science, Dr. Harvey Fletcher, father of Stereophonic Sound, former director of physical research at Bell Laboratories, and professor emeritus at Brigham Young University, adds his testimony.
I myself have a firm belief that God lives and that life has purpose for each one of us living here upon earth. I did not obtain that faith through scientific reasoning, but rather through spiritual experiences which are hard to explain to others, but nevertheless are very real. It's been my experience that a great many men of science believe in God. True religion never hesitates to be held up for investigation by men of science. This is borne out by the large number of scientists who have been and are now members of our church. For example, such men as Orson Pratt, James E. Talmage, John A. Widsoe, and Joseph F. Merrill. And many eminent scientists outside our church, such men as Michael Faraday, Louis Pasteur, James Clerk Maxwell, Robert A. Millikan, Michael Pupin, all believed in God. Let me read to you the testimony of Michael Pupin. At the time this was written, he was president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Professor Pupin said, "The real purpose of science is not merely to make material things, inventions to increase wealth and comfort. If science does not help to give me and others a better faith to live by, a better understanding of the Creator, a closer relationship to God, so that I can carry out the divine purpose, then science is a failure. The soul of man is the highest product of God's creative handiwork. Now, after God had spent untold time in creating man and endowing him with a soul, is it reasonable to suppose that man lives here on earth for a brief span and then is extinguished by death? That the soul perishes with the physical body? That it existed in vain? There's a growing tendency in this age to think that as one becomes mature, one must throw off a belief in God, just as one discards his belief in Santa Claus. Just where would such a position leave us? We would be forced then to admit that this beautiful world of ours was not the product of design and planning, but of mere undirected chance, that your dearest friend is simply a jumble of atoms and molecules that just happen to land together to make a dear and loving personality. I feel certain that in our quest for the mysteries of the physical universe, that the Lord will guide and direct us into new scientific findings. I also feel certain that if we search for a testimony with the same vigor and energy, that we will find that too. I have.
Likewise, Dr. Henry Eyring, Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Utah, and recently elected National President of the American Chemical Society, says,
"There is no doubt in my mind that God lives. I've had no serious difficulty in reconciling the truths of science with the truths of religion. Moreover, God has instilled in us a desire to search after the truth. I'm thankful that I belong to a church whose doctrines can be subjected to every test. I remember hearing of a young man going to college who decided to study science."
Gee, Annie, it's good to see you looking so well.
Well, thank you, dear. Charles, it just doesn't seem possible that you're going to the university this fall.
Well, after the summer I spent, it'll be a pleasure to work only 10 hours a day.
Charles, since your mother told me what you're going to study at the university, well, to tell you the truth, dear, it's worried me.
Worried you? Why, Aunt Claire? Anthropology and biology are both real interesting fields.
Well, I'm sure they are, Charles, but it's just that becoming a scientist, I'm afraid you'll lose your faith, that you might become a materialist or an agnostic.
Oh, Auntie, I'm sure that my faith in a creator is more deeply rooted than that.
Well, I don't know. They say some of those men at the university don't believe in the Bible at all. Charles, dear, it isn't too late to reconsider your course of study.
To this well-meaning relative, as to many other people, science and religion seem to be opposing forces. To embrace one is to give up the other. In contrast to this advice, which Aunt Claire gave Charles, I recall the advice my father gave me as I left to study my freshman year at the University of Arizona.
This mane straighten out a bit. Yes, sir.
Say, Dad, isn't it about time?
Well, let's see. That afternoon train leaves Pima about 5:30. We've still got a few minutes. Oh, you're going to Tucson to study science, huh? Well, that's what you want, isn't it?
That's right, Dad.
Well, now, I don't know much about science, son, but I know quite a bit about some other things. I do know the Lord spoke to the prophet and that the gospel is true. I know our gospel believes in truth regardless of its source. Now, I've tried to tell you the way things look to me, and maybe sometimes I've told you things that don't exactly jibe with the truth. But if I have, just discard them. In this church, you don't have to believe anything that isn't true. And if you want to be a scientist, son, you hit it just as hard as you can. Now, you're going to hear some things up there that don't jibe exactly with what you've learned in Sunday school, but don't worry about it. Just keep an open mind, and truth will eventually work its way to the surface. I don't worry about how much you learn. Study all the science you can. And if you'll remember your prayers and don't be profane, and live in such a way that you'll feel comfortable in the company of good people, then Mother and I will feel good about your going. And don't you worry about the gospel, son. It'll stand the test of all truth.
I appreciate what you're telling me, Dad, but let's not miss that train.
Well, see you later, Jeff. Seems like nowadays these young folks are always in a hurry. Well, come on, son. If it's speed you want, I'll show you how to make this board really rattle. Crank it up. Once more. There you've got it. Come on, boy. Make that train.
The Lord has instilled a desire to search for truth, that truth which my father mentioned, into our very beings. Man, in his ceaseless search for truth, has discovered and partially explored 6 different worlds. The first of these, that wonderful, practical, everyday world in which we live. A world in which things are measured in feet and inches, seconds and hours and days. Then we have a second world, the world of the biologist, a world that is microscopic, where cells are usually about a 10,000th of an inch across and may divide every few minutes. Next, we delve into the chemical world of molecules and atoms, where the atoms complete their vibrations in 100 million millionths of a second. Inside the nucleus of the atom, we enter a fourth world, a world where things are happening millions of times faster still. There is also a fifth world that we are beginning to know, a world of vast distances, where astronomers measure the revolutions of the planets in years, and where the unit of distance used for measurement, the light year, is about 6 million miles in length. And finally, there is the spiritual world, where time is measured in eternities, and space is limitless. Thus, in our minds, we can travel from the almost infinitesimally small to the infinitely large. Now, curiously enough, there are good people who would have you believe that man, who understands all these wonderful things and masters them in part, is no more than the dust of the earth to which his body returns. To me, this is inconceivable. Today, the increasing effort to understand man's place in the grand scheme of things proceeds at an accelerated pace. The answer to this problem won't all be found in the laboratory, because many of the most important answers to the question, where did I come from? What am I doing here? And where am I going after death? Will be found in the realm of the spiritual. And I don't think many scientists today would presume to say a thing may not be simply because they do not understand it. nor would they deny the validity of spiritual experiences of others, because they have been without such experiences themselves. Just as science has proven a help to religion, so religion in its finest expression has given impetus to science. There is no end to the progress of a man who seeks for truth. Death is not the end. It is but one more step in the great forward march made possible by the redemption of the Savior. Of this I am convinced.